March 12, 1967. A Shao Valley, Thua Thien Province, South Vietnam. Dawn hadn't yet broken, but the jungle was already awake, breathing, dripping, pulsing like a living organism. The air hung thick as soaked wool, clinging to the skin of every man pushing through the waist-high elephant grass. The point man specialist 4th class, Daniel Hawk Helverson, raised his fist, signaling the squad to halt. He didn't hear the enemy. No gunfire, no movement, just buzzing. The kind that made the fine hairs at the back of his neck rise. Behind him, Sergeant Vincent Doyle, the squad leader of 1st Platoon Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion 502nd Infantry, wiped a thin film of sweat from his upper lip. It didn't help. Within seconds, another layer formed. Sweat was endless out here, as constant as the humidity and the smell of wet rot. "Hold it," Doyle whispered, though his men were already frozen in place. The silence among them contrasted violently with the jungle's restless symphony, cicadas screaming from unseen branches, frogs croaking from mud pools, and the faint slithering of something moving beneath the underbrush. Doyle scanned the terrain. "Everyone hydrate," he muttered quietly, gesturing with 2 fingers. Small sips. "We've got a long hump east." The men obeyed. Private 1st Class Richie O'Hara, barely 19, pulled the cap off his plastic canteen and took a swallow. The water tasted metallic and faintly of iodine tablets, but it was the only thing keeping him upright. He felt lightheaded, dizzy. The fever had started the night before he hadn't told anyone. O'Hara looked at the others as they stood in staggered formation. Their faces were pale beneath grime and camouflage paint. Shallow breathing, heavy blinking, trying to stay alert, trying not to collapse. Because it wasn't the Viet Cong that had begun tearing through the platoon. It was Vietnam itself. 2 days earlier, Sergeant Doyle had 12 men on their feet. Now he had 9, 3 of them barely functioning. Corporal Mendez had gone down first, shaking and drenched in sweat, muttering he was freezing even in the 90-degree heat. Then came Private Collins, collapsing mid-patrol with a fever that left him delirious. And the night before, Private Jefferson had woken screaming blood vessels bulging at his temples as medics fought to bring down his temperature. The medics suspected malaria. The valley was crawling with it. "All right, move," Doyle whispered harshly, eyes narrowing. He motioned Hawk forward again. As they pushed deeper into the green darkness, the vegetation closed in around them, vines hanging like nooses, branches scraping against their rucksacks, clouds of insects rising with every footstep. The smells shifted with every yard: sour mud, mold, sweat gun oil, rotting foliage, and when the wind turned, an underlying musk of stagnant water. Private O'Hara stumbled on an exposed root. Doyle rushed to steady him. "You good, O'Hara?" "Yeah," Sarge O'Hara replied, though his voice cracked. "Just the heat." Doyle frowned. "The heat doesn't make you shiver." He pressed the back of his hand against O'Hara's forehead. The kid was burning up. Doc Doyle hissed over his shoulder. Specialist Harold Grayson, the platoon medic, pushed through the brush, his kit rattling. He assessed O'Hara with practiced speed, checking his eyes, pulse, breathing. "Fever's climbing," Grayson said. "Pulse is weak. I'm calling it probable malaria. We need to evac him before he crashes." "No radio contact this deep," Doyle replied bitterly. "We get to Hill 325 first, then we call it in." Grayson exhaled sharply. "Then he needs to stay moving. If he stops now, he might not get up again." The medic handed O'Hara a chloroquine pill. The private swallowed it dry, gagging on the bitterness. It wouldn't cure anything not out here, not this fast, but it was all they had. They moved again. 10 minutes later, the forest thinned momentarily, revealing a shallow stream no wider than 2 men lying end to end. Hawk motioned for the squad to form a defensive perimeter while Doyle inspected the water. It was murky, tinted brown with sediment. Leaves floated like dead insects on its surface. "We cross here," Doyle ordered. The men stepped into the stream one by one. The water was lukewarm, swirling around their boots and soaking their pant legs instantly. Something squirmed past Doyle's calf. He clenched his jaw. Leeches, Grayson muttered grimly. Lots of 'em. O'Hara glanced down. Tiny black threads clung to his skin just above his boot, ballooning as they filled with blood. He yelped and tried to swipe them off, but they held firm, their bodies pulsing rhythmically. Easy, kid, Grayson said, kneeling beside him. You don't yank 'em, you burn 'em. He ignited a match from a waterproof pack and held it close. The leeches recoiled, releasing their grip. Blood trickled freely from the wounds. Keep pressure on that, Grayson warned. O'Hara nodded weakly, but his eyes were unfocused. His legs trembled beneath him. Doyle watched the scene, feeling an unease far deeper than fear of enemy ambush. The jungle was stripping his men apart piece by piece, disease, exhaustion, infection, and they still had miles to go before reaching higher ground. He checked his map, then looked back at the squad, their faces slick with sweat and pale with sickness. Let's move, he ordered. But even he could hear the doubt in his own voice. The jungle wasn't an environment, it was an enemy. And this enemy didn't miss. The squad pushed eastward, boots sinking into the sponge-wet soil with every step. The jungle canopy thickened overhead until the light dimmed to a murky green twilight. It felt like walking beneath a drowned world. Every breath tasted of rot. Sergeant Doyle kept glancing back at O'Hara, who trudged along in a half-stagger, his M16 hanging low against his chest. His face glistened with sweat that had turned strangely cold, as if the fever inside him was fighting the air around him. Grayson shadowed him closely, ready for another collapse. Eyes up, Hawk signaled from the front, lifting his rifle slightly. The faint chatter of insects cut out abruptly. Even the frogs went silent. Doyle raised his fist for a halt. Something's off, Hawk whispered. Hear that? They all heard it. Nothing. A blanket of stillness thick enough to smother. Then a single sound broke it, a soft pattering, like rain. Except the sky above was clear. Doyle scanned upward. It was coming from the trees themselves, droplets falling from clusters of broad leaves, thick and cloudy. Not water. Sap-numb fungus spores. The wind had shifted just right to shake loose a fine, pale dust that drifted toward them like smoke. Mask up, Doyle barked. They fumbled quickly, pulling cloth scarves or shirt sleeves over their noses. O'Hara coughed violently before he could cover his mouth, doubling over as Grayson grabbed him. Fungal rot. Vietnam's forests were filled with it. The spores lived on dead leaves, fallen logs, damp bark. The medics warned the men about them back at Phu Bai base. Infection spread fast in the heat and wet, chewing through the skin like acid if left untreated. It's okay, Grayson said, trying to calm O'Hara. Just breathe shallow. But O'Hara couldn't stop shaking. His fever raged. The whites of his eyes had taken a faint yellow tint. Doyle leaned close to Grayson. How bad? Fever's pushing past 104, the medic whispered. He's dehydrated, getting delirious. If we don't get him out soon. He didn't finish the sentence. They resumed movement once the spore shower subsided. But 30 yards later, trouble found them again. Private Jennings cursed from the rear of the column. Sarge, something's wrong with my feet. Doyle signaled the squad into a tight 360 and jogged back. Jennings sat on a fallen stump, unlacing his soaked jungle boots. The moment he peeled off his wool socks, a stench burst out, pungent, sweet, rotten. Jesus, Jennings muttered. His entire foot was white and soft as clay. Layers of skin sloughed off with the sock, revealing raw red patches underneath. Grayson knelt to examine it. Immersion foot, the medic said grimly. Keep those boots wet too long, fungus eats the skin alive. If he keeps walking on this, it'll split open. Jennings swallowed hard. Can I keep going? You have to, Doyle said. We pull you out, now we pull us all out. We hold until Hill 325. Jennings nodded, jaw clenched, and forced his foot back into the boot. His face tightened with pain as he laced up again. The squad got moving once more. By midday, the temperature soared, turning the air into something thick enough to chew. Their helmets felt like iron pots heated over a stove. Sweat ran down their spines and soaked into their web gear, turning straps into abrasive ropes, cutting into their shoulders. At the front, Hawk stopped again and raised his hand. Doyle joined him at the point. "What is it?" Doyle asked. Hawk pointed to a muddy pool stretching across the narrowing trail. The water was dark, stagnant, and covered in a thin film of iridescent sheen, the kind of sheen that meant bacteria. Lots of it. "We go around," Doyle ordered, but the terrain was unforgiving. To the left, thorn bushes thick as wire tangled into an impenetrable wall. To the right, a steep rise of slippery stone coated in moss. "No clean way," Hawk said. Doyle cursed under his breath. They couldn't afford another leech encounter. Or worse, dysentery. The last thing they needed was men dropping with explosive diarrhea and dehydration in the middle of enemy territory. He stepped into the pool himself to test it. The mud sucked at his boot like a hungry mouth. Warm water seeped in instantly. "Move slow," Doyle said. "Keep your mouths closed. Don't swallow anything." The men followed reluctantly. O'Hara needed help from both Grayson and Private Lopez just to make it across. Every step looked like agony. Halfway through, O'Hara stopped. His knees buckled. His rifle slipped into the water. "Help him," Doyle barked. Grayson and Lopez hauled him up again, but O'Hara's eyes rolled back. His skin had taken on a waxy sheen. His breathing came in short, panicked bursts. "He's crashing," Grayson shouted. Doyle waded to them quickly. "We carry him." He motioned to Lopez and Jennings. Together, they hoisted O'Hara across their shoulders. The squad pushed through the rest of the swamp, emerging soaked, filthy, and exhausted. Once they reached dry ground, Doyle looked at his men. 8 soldiers still standing, 1 barely alive, and they hadn't even reached the halfway point. The jungle pressed around them again, dense and unforgiving, and somewhere ahead, the sun began to drop behind the mountains. They had to make it before nightfall. Previous section text. Continue seamlessly from where this left off. Do not use characters. The light drained out of the jungle faster than the men could advance. By late afternoon, the sky was a hazy orange smear above the canopy, the sun barely piercing the dense, interlocking branches. Sergeant Doyle checked his watch. They were behind schedule, and every passing minute meant the jungle grew bolder. "Pick it up," Doyle whispered, though exhaustion had slowed everyone to a crawl. Hawk moved ahead, machete in hand, chopping through vines that curled like living tentacles. Each strike sent insects scrambling and triggered bursts of humid air that smelled of rotting plants and unseen decay. The ground grew uneven beneath them, rising into ridges and sinking abruptly into mud pockets that swallowed their boots. Behind Hawk, Jennings limped heavily on his ruined foot. Every step sent a jolt of pain up his leg. He bit down on a strip of cloth to stay quiet. Private Lopez kept steadying him, not out of duty, but because the squad couldn't afford another man going down. O'Hara was worse. He drifted in and out of consciousness, slung between Grayson and Private Dalton like a sack of gear. His skin was burning. His lips cracked and every breath rattled. Grayson kept checking him every few minutes, feeling his pulse weaken. "Pulse is thready," Grayson muttered. "We're losing him." Doyle heard it, though he didn't respond. His own throat had tightened from dehydration. His uniform clung to him like wet paper. Even his M16 felt heavier than it should. As they pushed onward, the sound of running water faded into the distance behind them. In its place, a low, droning hum began to rise. At first, Doyle thought it was machinery. Then he realized mosquitoes. Thousands of them. They materialized from the shadows like a living fog. A swarm. Black specks filled the air, landing on their necks, forearms, cheeks. Slapping them off was useless. They came back instantly. "Jesus," Dalton hissed. "They're everywhere." Hawk pulled a small bottle of repellent from his pocket, but the humidity had already broken down what little effectiveness it had. The insects bit through uniforms, through fatigue, through sheer willpower. Each sting delivered a tiny jab of heat. Malaria on wings. O'Hara whimpered weakly as they descended on him, too drawn by the scent of sweat and the slight sweetness of fever. Grayson covered his exposed skin with a spare bandana, but the insects kept burrowing, drilling for blood. "Keep moving," Doyle ordered. Speed is our only defense. But the swarm followed them like a cloud. Minutes later, the forest floor dipped into a valley. A narrow ravine stretched ahead, darker than the rest of the jungle. The air here was suffocating, unmoving. Moisture beaded on every surface. A thick mist coiled just above the ground. Hawk knelt and inspected the mud. It was pocked with footprints. Fresh. Barefoot impressions. Viet Cong. Very recent. Doyle's stomach tightened. We're not alone out here. The men tightened their grip on their rifles, fingers brushing the triggers. Even Jennings straightened, ignoring the pain. Fear was a better stimulant than adrenaline now. They entered the ravine quietly, moving along a narrow path carved between moss-covered boulders. The temperature dropped sharply, but the humidity rose, clinging icy cold to their skin. Their breaths fogged faintly in front of them. As they pushed deeper, the smell hit them. Not rot, not mud. Human sickness. A stinging tang like vomit mixed with decayed fruit. Dysentery. Lopez gagged. Something died down here. It's the latrine trenches, Doyle whispered. Viet Cong camps use the ravine for waste runoff. The ground confirmed it, slicker than mud should be, with streaks of discoloration seeping downhill. Bacteria pooled in every puddle. Watch where you step, Grayson warned sharply. One cut, one scrape, and you're done. It was too late for Jennings. His immersion foot sores reopened as he stumbled forward, and he felt filthy water seep into the wounds. Damn it, he whispered. They emerged from the ravine 20 painful minutes later and collapsed briefly beneath a cluster of fallen trees. The jungle sounds returned: cicadas, frogs, distant bird calls, and with them came a faint breeze that carried the smell of wet leaves instead of human waste. O'Hara groaned, rolling his head weakly. He whispered something incoherent. Doyle crouched beside him. "Stay with us, son." The private's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "My chest hurts." Grayson leaned in quickly, placing his ear to O'Hara's sternum. He listened for several seconds, then looked up with dread in his eyes. "His heart's racing out of control," Grayson said quietly. "His fever's hitting the brain. If it spikes any higher, he'll seize or slip into a coma." The men exchanged uneasily glances. Then Hawk returned from his short perimeter sweep. "Bad news," he whispered. "We've got movement less than 200 yards out." "Slow. Could be VC scouts." Doyle stood instantly. "We can't stay here," he said. "We push for the ridge." Now, the exhausted squad rose again. They lifted O'Hara onto Lopez and Dalton's shoulders. Jennings tightened his jaw. Every man rechecked his weapon. And as night descended fully, the jungle came alive with eyes and whispers. Diseases might kill them slowly, but the enemy could do it swiftly, and the ridge was still a mile away. Night claimed the Ashau Valley with terrifying speed. One moment, there was the faint, dying glow of orange filtering through the canopy. The next, everything plunged into a depthless blackness broken only by the bobbing green shadows of their night-adapted eyes. The jungle did not sleep. It whispered. It breathed. It hunted. Sergeant Doyle signaled the squad to tighten formation. The ridge they needed to reach rose ahead like a jagged spine, its silhouette barely visible through the foliage. Hawk moved at the front, using the dull red beam of his angle-head flashlight on its lowest setting. The beam cut no more than a foot through the darkness, but it was better than nothing. "Watch your spacing," Doyle whispered. "Stay on my voice." The humidity grew colder now that the sun was gone. Mist coiled along the ground. The men stepped through it, their boots sinking silently. Every breath fogged faintly. The trails of vapor drifted upward, swallowed by the trees. Lopez and Dalton struggled under O'Hara's weight. The private's head lolled backward, his eyes half open, but seeing nothing. His skin had taken on a strange pallor, pale but flushed like a man burning from the inside out. His chest rose unevenly. Grayson checked him every few minutes, but each time his expression grew darker. "Heartbeats erratic," the medic murmured. "Pulse jumping, if his organs shut down." Doyle cut him off. "He won't die out here." He had to believe that. If he didn't, None of them would keep moving. Halfway up the ridge trail, the trees shifted from tall, straight trunks into twisted, knotted forms. Roots snaked across the path like thick ropes. The incline steepened. The men leaned forward, almost climbing now. Jennings stumbled repeatedly, gritting his teeth each time his mangled foot touched the ground. At one point, he slipped on a moss-coated rock and hit his knee hard enough to gasp. "Jennings," Doyle whispered sharply. "You need relief." The private shook his head. "No, Sarge. I can walk." But Grayson saw the truth. Blood seeped through Jennings' boot seams. His immersion foot had torn open again. Infection was setting in. The smell alone confirmed it. Still, Jennings pushed onward. A moment later, a twig snapped in the distance. Everyone froze. Doyle raised a closed fist. Hawk held his breath. The sound came again, a slow, careful shifting of weight. One step, then another, something moving across their flank. Grayson leaned close. "VC?" Doyle didn't answer. The jungle had a way of making everything sound like a threat. But this was deliberate movement. Human. He could sense it. Hawk motioned toward a cluster of tree trunks 10 yards ahead. Cover. They moved quickly, silently ducking behind the broad bases of roots and foliage. "Eyes out," Doyle whispered. The movement stopped. Total silence. Even the insects quieted. Lopez tightened his grip on O'Hara as if shielding him from whatever lurked beyond the darkness. Dalton raised his rifle finger, hovering near the trigger. Then a faint cough echoed through the trees. "Not one of theirs." Doyle stiffened. Grayson whispered, "They're sick too." But before Doyle could respond, movement rustled to the right, fast light, and then gone. Seconds later, a soft click sounded in the distance. Metal tapping metal, the unmistakable sound of someone switching a safety selector. Hawk mouthed silently to Doyle. "They know we're here." Doyle gestured for the squad to pull back, slowly staying low. He pointed toward a narrow cut in the ridge wall, a small natural hollow they could use for temporary cover. They moved quickly, though fear made their steps clumsy. As they squeezed into the hollow, O'Hara suddenly convulsed. His body jerked violently, knocking Dalton sideways. Foam bubbled from the corners of his mouth. "Seizure," Grayson whispered urgently, pulling the private fully into the hollow. "Get him on his side." Lopez and Dalton held O'Hara down as his muscles spasmed uncontrollably. His rifle clattered against the rock wall. Grayson stuffed a folded bandage between O'Hara's teeth to keep him from biting through the tongue. Outside, the rustling stopped. Someone had heard that. Doyle's heart pounded. He aimed his rifle toward the opening of the hollow, every sense tuned to the darkness. O'Hara's convulsions slowed, then stopped abruptly. His body sagged, his breathing shallow. Grayson wiped sweat from his forehead. "He's fading," the medic murmured. "I need to lower his temperature, or his brain's going to cook." How Dalton whispered. Grayson shook his head. "I don't know. We need cold water, ice, anything. But we can't cool him down out here." Before Doyle could speak, Jennings collapsed to one knee. His breath hitched. He pulled off his helmet and wiped his forehead with a shaky hand. "Sarge," Jennings whispered. "I don't feel right." Grayson spun toward him. "Let me see." But before the medic reached him, Jennings vomited violently into the dirt. His body trembled. His eyes glazed. Lopez whispered, "Jesus." "Are we all gonna go down?" Doyle forced himself to stay steady. "We're getting out of this valley." He didn't believe it. Not fully, but he said it. Hawk leaned close to Doyle, voice barely audible. Movement still out there. Getting closer. Doyle tightened his grip on his rifle. Trapped men. Trapped by disease. And now trapped by an enemy closing in. The ridge lay just ahead. Salvation. Evac. But between them and that point waited a jungle that wanted to bury them alive. The hollow offered only a moment of shelter. A shallow dent in the ridge wall barely large enough for 9 exhausted soldiers and 1 dying private. The darkness pressed in from every angle, thick enough that the men could feel it on their skin like damp cloth. Sweat trickled down their faces, mixing with grime, insect bites, and blood. Every breath tasted of fear and mildew. Doyle crouched at the hollow's entrance rifle, shouldered eyes fixed on the tangle of ferns, swaying unnaturally in the windless night. Something out there moved with purpose. He could hear controlled, practiced footfalls. A scout team, maybe 2 or 3 men. VC rarely traveled in large numbers at night unless attacking. These were hunters, listening, waiting. Behind him, O'Hara whimpered faintly as Grayson pressed a cool cloth, rinsed with the little clean water they had against his forehead. His breathing had grown shallow and uneven. Every inhale sounded like a struggle. Fever radiated off him in waves. "Temp's rising again," Grayson whispered. "He needs medical evac immediately or he's gone." "We're getting him out," Doyle murmured, though his voice cracked. Jennings sat slumped against the rock wall, his bandaged foot throbbing visibly beneath his boot. Lopez tore strips from his undershirt to reinforce the dressing, but the wound seeped steadily. The smell of infection, sickly sweet, began to drift through the hollow. Dalton stared at his rifle, shaking slightly in his hands. "Sarge, if they hit us while we're carrying O'Hara, what do we do?" Doyle didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because the truth was brutal. They couldn't outrun a fight. They could barely walk. O'Hara couldn't be moved quickly, Jennings could barely stand, and the rest were weakened from dehydration and disease. If the VC engaged them now, they'd be overrun in minutes. Hawk leaned into the hollow, crouched low. "We've got maybe 60 seconds before they check this ridge. 2 scouts, maybe 3. Then we move now," Doyle ordered. Silently. No talking. Keep low. Dalton and Lopez hoisted O'Hara again, careful to keep his limbs from hitting the rock. The private groaned in a feverish haze. Jennings forced himself upright with a grunt, leaning heavily on his rifle like a crutch. His face twisted, but he nodded. "I'm good, Sarge. I can walk." They slipped out of the hollow in a quiet procession. Doyle led Hawk behind him, scanning the flanks. The others followed in a tight, stumbling line. They kept to the shadows beneath twisted tree roots and overhanging branches. Every movement had to be measured, every breath controlled. Halfway up the ridge, the forest opened into a small clearing no wider than a living room. A faint glimmer of moonlight filtered through the canopy, revealing patches of knee-high grass. Doyle motioned for the squad to cross quickly, but then he froze. Footprints again. Fresh, bare, light, moving uphill, and next to them small splatters of blood. Hawk whispered, "Sarge, they're hurt. Whoever's ahead of us, they're sick too." Doyle knelt, touching the edges of the print. Still warm, human body heat lingering in the soil. He stood quickly. "We move. Now." They crossed the clearing at a crouched sprint, but the jungle did not let them pass quietly. A branch snapped beneath Dalton's foot. Not loud, but loud enough. Voices erupted instantly in the dark, sharp, urgent whispers in Vietnamese. "Close." Down, Doyle hissed. The squad dove into the brush at the edge of the clearing. Hawk killed his flashlight. The men went still, barely daring to breathe. Shadows appeared at the far edge of the clearing. 3 VC fighters' silhouettes with slung AKs and lean frames. Even at a distance, Doyle could see the way they moved sluggishly. One held his stomach. Another coughed violently, doubling over. The third wiped sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. Sick. They were sick too. The enemy soldiers exchanged hushed words, then moved off the trail and continued uphill toward the ridge Doyle needed. Toward the only extraction point. Lopez whispered faintly, "If they get there first, we're boxed in." Grayson pressed the back of his hand to O'Hara's cheek. "He won't last long." Doyle clenched his jaw. The jungle had become a funnel, driving all of them, Americans and Viet Cong alike, toward the same high ground. Disease had leveled the battlefield. Death stalked both sides. He signaled the squad forward again once the VC disappeared into the dark. They pushed on every step, heavier than the last. Jennings stumbled again. Fell, tried to get up, couldn't. Dalton moved to help him, but Jennings waved him off. "Leave me," he whispered. "I'm slowing everyone down." Doyle crouched next to him. You're not dying on my ridge. Jennings looked up, eyes wet. Sarge, my foot's gone. I can't feel half my leg. I'm dead weight. Doyle grabbed his shoulder firmly. You're a soldier in my platoon, and you're walking out. Jennings swallowed hard, nodded, and with Dalton's help, forced himself upright once more. They climbed in silence. Higher, higher. The air thinned but cooled slightly, offering brief comfort. The mosquitoes eased, even the jungle's noises softened, but the diseases they marched with them. Inside their blood, inside their lungs, inside their boots. As they neared the ridge crest, Hawk raised his clenched fist. Movement, he whispered. On the ridge line. Doyle lifted his rifle. VC. Hawk squinted. Can't tell. Then a cry split the night. Human, agonized. Not O'Hara, not Jennings, and not any of the men beside them. Something was happening on the ridge ahead. Something bad. The cry echoed down the ridge roar, panicked, unmistakably human. Doyle halted the squad with a raised fist. Every man stiffened, eyes fixed on the silhouetted crest above them. Hawk crept forward 2 steps, dropped to a knee, and scanned the ridge with disciplined precision. Lopez whispered. What was that? Before anyone could answer, a second sound pierced the night. Gunfire. One sharp burst from an AK, then another, then silence. Doyle crouched low, signaling the men to tighten up. They were too close to the ridge now to retreat, and the clearing above, where the radio signal would be clearest, was the only hope for O'Hara. Grayson leaned over the fever-ravaged private. Stay with me, O'Hara. We're almost there. The words were gentle, but the medic's hands trembled. O'Hara's breathing had become a shallow rasp. His skin was dangerously hot to the touch. His eyes flickered under half-closed lids. Malaria had sunk its claws deep brain-blood organs. He was moments away from slipping under for good. Doyle gestured forward. The squad climbed the last stretch of the ridge using hands and knees, digging fingers into root and soil. Up close, the crest revealed itself as a narrow plateau flanked by boulders and thick bamboo stands. Moonlight spilled onto the clearing beyond. 2 bodies lay there, VC scouts, both barefoot. Both collapsed in contorted positions. One lay curled on his side, clutching his abdomen. The other had collapsed face first in the dirt, his rifle still slung around his shoulder. Neither looked shot. Grayson knelt beside one. These men, they're fevered. Bad. Same symptoms as O'Hara, but faster onset. Could be severe cerebral malaria. Doyle scanned the tree line. Where's the one who fired? Hawk pointed. A lean figure staggered behind a cluster of bamboo rifle hanging at his side. His steps were slow, unsteady. Doyle raised his weapon finger tight on the trigger, but the man collapsed before Doyle had to make a choice. Disease had done what bullets didn't. Dalton exhaled shakily. Everyone's dying out here. Doyle didn't respond. He couldn't. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sweat vomit and wet earth. But they'd reached the ridge. Set O'Hara down, Doyle ordered. Hawk radio out. Hawk unslung the PRC-25 from his pack. His hands shook as he extended the antenna. Grayson propped O'Hara's head on his lap, fanning the private with a spare cloth. Hang in there, kid, the medic whispered. Don't you go. O'Hara's lips moved faintly. Mom, water. Grayson's composure cracked for a heartbeat. Hawk keyed the radio. Static hissed. He adjusted the frequency. Tried again. This is Bravo 25, requesting immediate medevac at grid 91-406. 1 critical malaria casualty, multiple wounded enemy presence, light, repeat, light. We need extraction before dawn. Over. Static. Then. Bravo. 25 read you faint. Say again. Hawk's shoulders dropped in relief. This is Bravo 25. Requesting medevac. Priority urgent. We have casualties deteriorating by the minute. Copy. Bird inbound. ETA 40 minutes. Hold position. Doyle nodded. All right. Defensive perimeter. No one relaxes until we're wheels up. The men spread out. Dalton and Lopez took the northern arc. Jennings leaned against a boulder rifle across his lap, breathing hard. His fever had risen, 2 skin-pale pupils dilated, but he held his weapon steady. Minutes trickled by. Mosquitoes swarmed again, hungry and relentless. The ridge offered no shelter from the biting wind or the nauseating humidity. O'Hara's breathing slowed to a feeble flutter. Grayson pressed a wet cloth to his chest, whispering steady reassurance. Then the night vibrated. At first it was faint, a distant whoomp, whoomp, whoomp drifting over the valley. Doyle stood scanning the sky. Headlights flared low between the trees as the medevac Huey approached, skimming just above the canopy. The sound grew louder, beating air, cutting through mist, shaking leaves loose from branches. The men lifted their heads. Lopez whispered, "I've never heard anything more beautiful." The Huey angled closer, rotors chopping the night. Its landing lights painted the ridge in hard white beams. The clearing filled with dust and broken foliage as it hovered inches above the ground. But the jungle wasn't done. From the tree line below, rifles cracked sporadic but close. "Contact!" Dalton shouted. Doyle grabbed his M16. "Defensive fire. Keep them off the bird." Jennings fired, first sending controlled bursts into the darkness. Hawk and Lopez joined a heartbeat later. Tracer rounds streaked through the trees. The VC, weakened but still dangerous, crawled toward the perimeter with desperate determination. The Huey's door gunner unleashed a stream of fire, shredding bamboo stalks and sending the attackers scattering. "Move, O'Hara," Doyle shouted. Grayson and Dalton lifted the private onto a stretcher and rushed him toward the helicopter. The door gunner reached down, helping pull the stretcher aboard. Grayson climbed in after him. Lopez yelled, "Jennings, go. You're next." Jennings tried to stand, but his leg buckled. Doyle slung the private's arm over his shoulder and hauled him toward the bird. Bullets snapped overhead as the jungle spat its last fury at them. Dalton and Lopez provided covering fire until the last possible second. Doyle shoved Jennings into the Huey. Lopez scrambled aboard next. Dalton jumped in after him. Hawk backed toward the chopper, firing in short bursts, then leapt aboard as Doyle reached for his hand. The Huey lifted. The ridge fell away beneath them and the jungle receded into endless darkness. Inside the bird, Grayson held O'Hara's hand tight, monitoring his shallow breaths. Doyle looked at his men, fevered, exhausted, torn apart, not by bullets or ambushes, but by the jungle itself. The medic met Doyle's eyes. "If we were out there one more hour, we'd have lost him." Doyle nodded slowly. The Huey banked toward base rotors, thundering. Behind them, the Ashau Valley swallowed its dead American and Vietnamese alike under its humid, diseased shroud.